In the early 1400s, in the English port town of Bishop's Lynn, a woman named Margery Kempe opened a brewery. On paper, it was the safest business in the world. Ale wasn't a luxury in medieval England. It was breakfast. It was wages. Everyone drank it. Men, women, monks, children, every single day. Margery wasn't selling a luxury. She was selling one of medieval England's everyday essentials. And by her own account, she became one of the greatest brewers in town. For about 3 years. Then, batch after batch, something went wrong. The froth on her ale collapsed. The beer went flat and spoiled. Her own servants were so ashamed they walked out. Margery Kempe lost everything, and we only know this because she told us. Her memoir is the first autobiography ever written in English, and in it, a failed brewery. Which raises a strange question. In a world where everyone drank beer every day, how do you go broke making it? The answer is hiding inside a 700-year-old ledger. And it starts with a story you've probably heard before. One that historians say is almost completely wrong. You've probably heard the story. Medieval people drank beer because the water would kill them. Rivers full of sewage, wells full of disease. So everyone, even children, stayed drunk on ale from morning to night, just to survive. It's one of the most repeated facts about the Middle Ages. And historians say it's almost entirely wrong. Medieval people drank water all the time. Monastic rules mention it. Medical texts recommended it, as long as it came from a clean spring or well. And medieval cities took clean water seriously. In the 1230s, London began building the Great Conduit, a system of lead pipes carrying fresh spring water from outside the city, straight into the heart of town, for free. But the best argument against the myth isn't a document. It's simple math. The historian Anne Hagen ran the numbers. If every person in medieval England really drank ale as their main liquid, a gallon a day, the amount of grain required would have swallowed most of the country's farmland. There simply wasn't enough barley in England to keep everyone drunk. The land itself says the story is false. So no, medieval people didn't drink ale because they were afraid of water. They drank it because it was food. A thick, unfiltered medieval ale was packed with calories, closer to liquid bread than to the beer we drink today. For a laborer working sunrise to sunset, ale wasn't a vice. It was fuel. Harvest workers were sometimes paid with a gallon of it a day, as part of their wages. And that's what made brewing look like such an irresistible business. You weren't selling a drink, you were selling energy to a country that ran on it. So who was actually making all this ale? The answer might surprise you. Not merchants, not monks, not guildmasters in fine robes. Women. For roughly 300 years, brewing in England was overwhelmingly women's work. Historians call them brewsters. And when researchers like Judith Bennett combed through medieval court records, they found them everywhere. In some villages, nearly every household that brewed for sale had a woman running the operation. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Brewing didn't need a workshop or a storefront. It happened in the kitchen, with the same pots, the same fire, and the same grain a household already used for baking. Ale was made from the ingredients of daily cooking, so the person who managed the household naturally became the person who brewed. And because a single batch made more than one family could drink before it spoiled, the surplus went out the door, sold to neighbors, a few pennies at a time. That's how a chore quietly became a business. A wife might brew once a month, when money was tight. A widow might brew every week, because it was one of the few respectable trades open to her. And when a fresh batch was ready, she'd hang a pole above her door. The ale stake. No sign, no shop name. Just a stick jutting into the street, telling the whole village, come and drink. Some women went further. They brewed on schedule, bought extra grain, hired help, and turned their kitchen into something like a small factory, which is exactly what Margery Kempe tried to do. Because here's the thing about scaling up. The moment you go from brewing for neighbors to brewing for a town, everything changes. You need equipment, fuel, storage, and a lot of grain. So what did it actually cost to open a medieval brewery? Let's look at the receipts. Imagine it's the year 1300, and you've decided to open a brewery. Before you sell a single drop of ale, the money starts flowing, in one direction, out. First, you need space. Brewing at commercial scale doesn't fit in an ordinary kitchen anymore. You need a brew house, room for vats, storage for grain, and somewhere cool to keep the ale from spoiling. Larger operations, like the great monasteries, had entire dedicated buildings. The famous plan of the Abbey of St. Gall didn't include one brewery. It included 3. Then comes the equipment. A great copper kettle for boiling, one of the most expensive objects a household could own, often worth more than everything else in the brew house combined. Wooden mash vats, troughs for cooling, barrels and more barrels, ladles, sieves, stirring paddles. None of it cheap, all of it needed before day one. And then the biggest cost of all, the one that never stops, grain. Grain was to a medieval brewery what fuel is to an airline, the single largest expense, and completely at the mercy of forces beyond your control. A bad harvest could double your costs overnight, and you couldn't even process it yourself. Your grain had to go through the Lord's mill, and the miller took his cut of every sack, typically around 1 part in 20. Before you'd brewed a single gallon, someone else already had a hand in your grain. Add firewood, because brewing means boiling. for hours. Add water, hauled or paid for. Add helping hands on brewing day. Stack it all up, and opening a brewery meant sinking a serious pile of silver into the ground. Vats, copper, grain, and fuel, all before one mug of ale ever crossed a counter. Which raises the question every business must eventually answer. Would the brewery ever earn that money back? To find out, we need to open the books of a real one, and luckily, one survived. By a stroke of luck, the books of one medieval brewery survived. The brewery of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, where clerks recorded, batch by batch, what went in and what came out. It's one of the clearest windows we have into medieval brewing at scale. And it starts with a gamble. Because before ale can earn a penny, the grain has to survive 6 dangerous steps. First, malting. The barley is soaked in water and allowed to sprout, just enough to unlock the sugars trapped inside. Then it's dried over heat. Too little, and the grain stays useless. Too much, and it scorches. Either way, the money you spent on that grain is gone. Next, the malt goes to the mill to be ground. Then comes the step that made or broke a brewer, mashing. The crushed malt is stirred into hot water, and the temperature has to be right. Hot enough to draw out the sugars, not so hot that it kills the process entirely. And here's the thing. Medieval brewers had no thermometers, no gauges, no instruments of any kind. They judged the water by eye, by steam, by feel, by pure experience. One wrong guess and an entire batch, weeks of labor and a small fortune in grain, was ruined. If the mash survived, the sweet liquid was boiled for hours, devouring firewood. Then cooled, slowly, in open troughs, exposed to the air and everything floating in it. And finally, fermentation. Yeast turning sugar into ale. Or on a bad day, turning nothing into nothing. This was Margery Kempe's fate. Batch after batch, the froth collapsing, the ale spoiling, and no way to know why. At St. Paul's, the scale of this gamble was staggering. Around 100 batches a year, tens of thousands of gallons of ale. Which brings us to the strangest number in the entire ledger. Of all those gallons, almost none were ever sold. So where did the money actually come from? In a single year, the brewery of St. Paul's Cathedral produced nearly 68,000 gallons of ale. And it sold 37. Not 37,000, 37 gallons. Out of 68,000. By every modern instinct, this business should have collapsed in a week. So what was going on? Here's the answer. St. Paul's wasn't really selling ale because it didn't have to. Almost every gallon was drunk inside the cathedral's own walls. The canons, the clergy, the staff, the servants. They were all owed ale as part of their daily allowance. The brewery wasn't a shop. It was a payroll department. Instead of handing out coins, the cathedral handed out beer. But here's where it gets interesting. Because the ledger shows the brewery still earned real money. Not from the ale itself, from what the ale left behind. Every batch produced yeast. The living froth skimmed off the top, and brewers across London needed it to start their own batches. St. Paul's sold it. Every batch also left behind mountains of spent grain, soggy and sweet, worthless to people, irresistible to pigs and cattle. Farmers paid for it. The waste was the product. In the ledger, the leftovers earned more than the ale. Now, an important warning. St. Paul's was not a typical brewery. It was an institution, brewing for its own people, with cathedral money behind it. It could shrug off a bad batch. Margery Kempe could not. A commercial brewer lived or died on selling every gallon at market price, and every ruined batch came straight out of her own purse. But institutional or commercial, every brewer in England shared one problem. Because the moment you did try to sell your ale on the open market, the government was waiting for you. And the law they wrote for ale might be the strangest business regulation of the entire Middle. In the 13th century, the English crown passed one of the most remarkable business regulations of the Middle Ages, the assize of bread and ale. The idea was simple. Bread and ale were the two things everyone needed. So the law fixed their prices. Not the brewer, not the market, the government. And the price of ale wasn't chosen at random. It was chained directly to the price of grain. When grain was cheap, ale had to be cheap. When grain got expensive, brewers were allowed to charge a little more, but only by the official formula, which sounds fair, until you're the brewer. Because grain prices could swing violently, a wet summer, a failed harvest, while the ale price crept along behind, always a step too slow. Your biggest cost could surge, and you couldn't simply raise your price to cover it. The law wouldn't let you. And the law came to check. Towns appointed officials called ale conners, inspectors whose actual job was to taste the ale, test its quality, and make sure every brewer used honest measures. Sell a short gallon, or weak ale at full price, and you were fined. Here's the strange part. In the court records, the same brewers appear again and again, fined year after year after year. Were they all criminals? Historians don't think so. The fines were so routine, so predictable, that many now believe they worked less like punishments and more like a licensing fee, a quiet tax on everyone in the trade. Breaking the assize wasn't the exception. It was the business model. So picture the squeeze. Grain prices you can't control. Sale prices you can't set. Inspectors at your door and fines on your ledger. The margins weren't just thin, they were designed to be thin. And then, from across the sea, came something that would rewrite the rules entirely. Not a law, a plant. Ages. Not a law, a plant. Hops. A climbing vine with small green cones, bitter, fragrant, and hiding a secret that would transform brewing forever. For centuries, English ale was made without them, flavored instead with a blend of herbs. It tasted fine. But it had a fatal flaw. It spoiled within days. Every batch was a race against time. Hops changed that. They didn't just add flavor, they acted as a natural preservative. Hop beer could last for weeks, even months. And the moment beer could survive a journey, beer became something new, cargo. Nowhere seized this opportunity like the German port of Hamburg. By the late 1300s, Hamburg had hundreds of breweries, and beer had become one of its dominant exports. Barrels by the thousand, sailing across the North Sea on the trade routes of the Hanseatic League. This wasn't a widow brewing in her kitchen. This was industry. Ships, warehouses, contracts, capital. And when that beer, and that business model, reached England, the ground shifted under every small brewster in the country. Because brewing at this new scale demanded money. Bigger kettles, bigger buildings, credit, connections. Resources that, in medieval England, mostly belonged to men. Judith Bennett's research traces what happened next. As brewing became more profitable and more professional, women were gradually squeezed toward the edges of the trade. Not overnight, and not by any single law, but decade by decade, the brewster gave way to the brewer. The Black Death accelerated everything. After the plague killed nearly half of England, the survivors earned higher wages, and spent them. Demand for ale surged. And rising demand rewarded exactly one thing: scale. Which brings us back to Margery Kempe. She wasn't just unlucky. She entered brewing at the precise moment the trade was tilting away from people like her. Toward capital, toward scale, toward the big operations that could absorb a bad batch and keep going. Her spoiled ale ended the business. But the industry itself was already leaving her behind. So, knowing everything we now know, was owning a medieval brewery actually a good business? Let's settle it. So, was owning a medieval brewery actually a good business? Here's the honest answer. It depends what you mean by good. Could you make a living? Yes. For thousands of ordinary women, brewing was exactly that. A few pennies here, a few shillings there. Steady, respectable, useful money. A cushion between a household and hard times. Could you get rich? Almost never. The math simply wouldn't allow it. Grain prices you couldn't control. Sale prices you weren't allowed to set. Fines that arrived as predictably as the seasons. And a production process where one wrong guess, one invisible failure of yeast or heat, could erase a month of grain money overnight. The brewers who thrived were the ones who could absorb those blows. The monasteries and cathedrals, brewing on scale with institutional money behind them. And later, the great commercial operations, with capital, credit, and hopped beer that could survive a sea voyage. In brewing, wealth didn't flow to the hardest work. It flowed to whoever could afford to fail. Margery Kempe couldn't. Her collapsed batches ended her business. But her real misfortune was timing. She built a household enterprise in the final years of the household era, in a trade already tilting towards scale. And maybe that's the part worth remembering. A guaranteed market. A product everyone wanted, every single day. And still, thin margins, brutal risk, and an industry that rewarded capital over craft. 700 years later, we call it a startup. Medieval England just called it brewing.